Hello! That probably sounds really weird. Hi, so my name is Tails. I have a face, and I have a book. This is probably going to be very awkward. I've never done a book review before, and honestly, I don't think up until now I ever thought I would be. So I'm trying something very new. Give me some slack here. Today we're going to talk about The Book of Dragons, as edited by Jonathan Strahan. Shows you how much thought and time and effort I've put into this book that I couldn't even figure out. The Book of Dragons by Jonathan Strahan. So as a bit of a background, I love dragons. I'm not really any sort of aficionado on lore and mythos and all that, but just they're so aesthetically pleasing. And when I saw this book at Barnes & Noble, I was walking by and immediately picked it up and said, oh, this is mine now. This is mine now. I thought I would just kind of give a little bit of a review, both like just a little spoiler-free review first, and then a discussion on my most favorite and my least favorite works in the collection. So here we go. To start off the spoiler-free part of this, just as a general book review, this is an anthology. It's a collection of stories from different authors. It's mostly prose work, like short stories and almost bordering on novellas, but there is some poetry in there as well. And it is also very delightfully illustrated by Rowena Kai. Super props on her art style, it's really good. So when I went into this anthology, I, had peeled open a few pages, as I do before I buy things, just, to see. And I already knew off the bat that there were going to be some modern works. I say that not necessarily in when they were written, but in the style that they're in. They are not set in like a high fantasy sort of realm. There's a lot of things where, oh, present day, but also dragons. And I thought, well, okay, I'm still gonna have a decent amount of high fantasy in there. This is what I'm here for, but I could take a little something new. So the first thing I noticed in reading the anthology is that it's primarily modern stories. That's not inherently bad, of course, but I was hoping for more high fantasy dragons. I kind of narrowed it down, and I'd say about 1/3 of the stories actually have a high fantasy or like antiquated feel to the setting. Others are either science fiction or they are like in a modern era setting, whether it's an alternate Earth or actual present day, somewhere around wherever, I don't know, places. The very first 5 short stories are all set in a modern era, and that made me so sad. But that being said, I really did enjoy this anthology. Did I absolutely love everything? No. But, I mean, that's going to happen when you've got different authors, different styles, different ways of storytelling, different subgenres all throughout the story. You're gonna get different things. So, all in all, I enjoyed it. It wasn't what I was hoping it would be, but I did enjoy it. It's not necessarily an all readers kind of book. It does have some very strong language in several different stories. It does have a decent chunk of violence and even like going into gore. There's a good chunk of that. There are some sensitive themes too in terms of like sexual abuse and things like that. So it's like an advanced teen reader / adult reader book. But it wouldn't necessarily stop me from recommending it. I guess it just depends on who I'm recommending it to. But if you like dragons, there are dragons. I don't know, I'm bad at number ratings, but I'd say overall, I'd probably give it like a 7 out of 10, which to me is like, this is better than average. Not so amazing, but it's better than average, so I think it's pretty good. So now that that's out of the way, I would like to get into the spoilery portion of this, which is going to be my top 3 and bottom 3 stories or works of the anthology. I'm going to kind of alternate so it's not all just good news, bad news all at once. But I'm going to start with my third to last, second to last. I never understand how that works, but I'm going to start with my third to last favorite, then go to my third favorite, and then kind of keep swapping down the line until we get to my most favorite story of them all. So yeah. I don't know what I'm doing. Anyways, so number 3 on my least favorite, which I should probably preface this by saying, just because they're my least favorite doesn't mean I think they're bad works inherently. It's just I didn't enjoy them for various reasons, or even I enjoyed them, but there was a reason why in the space of this anthology I didn't think they were necessarily they weren't my favorite. they just weren't. Number 3 on my least favorite list is What Heroism Tells Us by Jane Yolen. Now, this is a poem. It's the only poem I'm going to talk about in this video. I want to start off by saying it's a very good poem. It's very short, it's very concise, but I think it is just, it's beautifully written. It gives nice, short, sharp little bursts of imagery, and I think it's lovely. It also only mentions dragons once. And if you've read the book, you know that this is the work that starts the anthology. It only talks about dragons one time. It's beautifully done. Under any circumstances, I would say this is a great poem. I mean, is it the best poem I've ever read? No. But it's really good. But there's something about the idea that you're starting a book about dragons with a poem that only mentions dragons by name once and really doesn't have anything to do with dragons, and instead has to do with heroism and fantasy and storytelling, and it's like, maybe that wasn't the right choice. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, again, it was still nice. It just, maybe just a poor start. Now, switching over to number 3 of my favorite works of the anthology is We Continue by Ann Leckie and Rachel Swirsky. Something about this story gets me. And actually, it's a lot of things, and I'll explain why. So starting off, I really appreciated that the way the dragons were represented from a visual standpoint in this story were kind of just a typical dragon, generic dragon, which of course there are many different styles of dragons in many different mythologies, but it seems like this leans a little bit closer to like the Western dragon stereotypes that I was more used to and kind of grew up with. So that just makes me happy. Even though this is a story in the sci-fi subgenre, I love it. I love it so much. Because the world building is actually really, really interesting. I like what they did about, the kind of the colonization thing, which was done by, I think, a couple other stories in the anthology. But this one, I feel like, just kind of explained the world in a very short period of time much better, and didn't try to overcomplicate itself, but still had a very good baseline story and motivation for kind of the things that were going on in the human realm. A couple of the things that I really loved about this is that it, even though it was the typical dragon imagery that I was expecting, it also threw a few different elements in that I love in fiction, but that I've never seen done with dragons before. For one, the dragon Auntie, or Collector as she calls herself, does not speak human, does not speak English, does not speak whatever the language is that the people speak. She speaks, dragon language. But when communicating with her child, when communicating with, oh goodness, what was his name? I don't know. He had a name. It's probably over here now. But when communicating with the human in her life, she uses mimicry. of other human phrases that she's heard, and I love the use of mimicry in storytelling, because it gives the author, or authors in this case, it gives the authors a chance to use the English language in new ways, because you're using the same words, but they might be using a different meaning, whether the sentences are being like cannibalized from something else to still mean what the character wants it to mean, or in the case of the dragon, it's just kind of filler language, but it's really charming and it's really unique, and I like how there's, you know, that bond of communication, that even though the dragon and the human can't actually share a language, you know, the dragon still tries, and I think that's really nice. Also incorporated with the dragons is something that I haven't seen but I find really interesting. It's a hive dynamic, because most of the time you see dragons either as like kind of the loners, the lone wolves off by themselves, or they'll be kind of like a pack dynamic. But this one actually incorporates a hive dynamic, very similar to almost like a beehive, which, though I can't stand bees, I do find like insectoid behavior and hive dynamics very interesting. So the fact that that was applied to dragons for the first time that I've ever seen that, I think it was really interesting and a really cool take on it. Space dragons, you know, hey man, they do what they do. I also appreciate the switching points of view between the human and the dragon. It's just a really good way to, you know, get like a full circle picture. Usually I tend to read and write from a singular point of view, but sometimes having that double POV is good because you see two different sides to the same story, so I find that really interesting. I mean, yeah, no duh. Also too, and this is going to be the last point that I talk about, there's a very nice contrast of found family and blood family relationships. So obviously there's the dynamic with Collector and her hive, but there's also the dynamic with the humans and their families, whether it's, I really have to look up his name. Goodness gracious, what? Why am I forgetting these things? Somebody help. Jacques. Jack. I don't know. We're gonna call him Jacques because that sounds right. So there's Jacques and his family who he was separated from, and then there is Stella and her family who she was only temporarily separated from, but she's dealing with the grief of losing her brother. All this huge theme of loss in each of the characters' families, whether they're losing themselves or losing their families or losing both. But then there's also this very strong bond between Jacques and his auntie. There's a blossoming bond, even though it is a little bit rushed, it is a little bit forced. There's a blossoming bond between Stella and Jacques. And it's just, I love found family in stories. I love it so, so, so very much. So the fact that, you know, it kind of makes that subtle contrast in the background is just something I absolutely love. So moving on to number 2 of my least favorites, which actually is interesting because going on Goodreads and reading a few reviews, I've noticed that a lot of people really enjoyed this story, but I in particular didn't, and you'll find out why. It's A Whisper of Blue by Ken Liu. I'm probably not pronouncing that last name right. I'm very bad at names, so you'll have to forgive me. So I want to start off by saying that I did find the world building interesting in this one. It had an alternate America kind of, I don't know, in a way I want to say it feels kind of Fallout-ish, because instead of it being like the Massachusetts area, it's the Commonwealth of something, and I like those alternate Earths. I like those different timelines, so I found it, you know, very, very interesting just from the get-go. And while the dragons don't really have much personification to them, which I do prefer dragons with character as to dragons that are just, yeah, beasts, dragons, rawr. I did find it interesting the fact that the author basically just created this whole big bubble of an alternate universe wherein dragons are a power source, and did it very expertly. But the reason why I'm not really a fan of this story, it's kind of 2 reasons. My first problem with the story itself is the way it's told. Now, I understand that a lot of people find like the documentary or mockumentary style of storytelling very interesting, and it makes sense, and I do find it an interesting way of storytelling. It's just not for me, maybe. It's very script-like, and even though coming from a theater background, I'm totally used to storytelling off of scripts, it just, I don't know, I'd rather read something that's just kind of in slightly more normalized prose. It turned out kind of clunky. Naturally, the way that people speak, we don't always give all the details that are necessary for a full story. I understand what the author was going for with the kind of expositional storytelling. It's necessary. How else are we going to know how the world works? The problem is when you're framing that as being something that's coming out of the mouth of actual human beings, it feels stilted. It doesn't feel like real dialogue, because it's not. You could tell that the way it works in the story is as like just straight expositional prose. It's not dialogue. But from the character's perspective, if you put yourself in their shoes, this is them speaking. This is them having a dialogue. So for some characters, like the crazy inventor scientist one, that makes sense for them to be expositional. When you have some of the other characters, it just seems more stilted when it's coming from them. It doesn't seem natural. So I did take some issue to that. The other thing I take issue in is kind of the, I can't really say it was a subtle undertone, because ultimately it was the end of the story. It was the main point. But the plot thread of, you know, I don't remember anybody's names. This is bad. It's been a bit. What was her name? Her name was Zoe. The whole story, plot thread, character arc of Zoe and the grief of losing her mother and the adverse reaction she ends up having towards the color blue. I love explorations of grief and loss and mental illness and things like that in storytelling. I just think that the human brain is a really wonderful, fantastic thing, and it's very interesting to kind of pick apart how it works. But ultimately, the story kind of leans towards the idea of, hey, it's okay to just forget everything. Forget everything in your grief that happened, and that's a totally healthy way to cope. Now, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a specialist of any form, I'm not a therapist, I don't know what really works for people, but in my experience, forgetting isn't really going to help anyone get over their loss, because if the loss doesn't exist, what is there to get over? And I feel like that's less healthy than just coming to terms with loss, coming to terms with grief. As somebody who's had to do that multiple times in her life, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, ultimately it's healthier if you work through it, because you become stronger. If your grief, if your memory is just taken away, there's no ability to become stronger through your trials. Wasn't super a fan of that conclusion, because I just felt like it was not as healthy as it was made out to be, but that could just be my opinion. I don't know. So number 2 on my absolute favorites list, Dragon Slayer by Michael Swanwick. Oh my gosh, this was beautiful. It was all the high fantasy that I was hoping for. The author does such an amazing job of creating a world in such a short period of time. Like, honestly, I felt like I had read a whole book just in the matter of, less than 50 pages. The world building was so concise and so rich that just automatically I could just see everything, and I could imagine everything with a lot of vivid detail. So the prose was just very descriptive and very nice. The characters were really great in that they took a lot of tried and true tropes. I try saying saying that 5 times fast. I can barely even say it once. They took these tropes and just flipped a couple things on their head so that everything was comfortable but not stale. And I appreciated that very much. The ending to the story was a little bit abrupt. That's probably the only real criticism I have for it, and also kind of the twist of like, oh, young child eventually marries master. This felt kind of weird, but okay, if that's what you want. Going back to the idea of tropes, not necessarily just the character tropes, but tropes in general, there were a couple of moments where I was reflecting on the story and kind of going, why do I love this so much? Like, I know I love it. It's got a very almost Narnian feel to it, like a Horse and His Boy kind of spin-off material. But it's like, why do I love this? And then I kind of flash back and realize, oh, it's because this reminds me of something. Like, for instance, the reveal of the boy Nahal actually being the girl Nahala and being in disguise. I'm like, why do I like this trope? It's been in a lot of media, especially from when I was growing up, but specifically it gave me super big flashbacks to the film The Swiss Family Robinson, and I don't remember the name of the character, but I very distinctly remember the fact that there was a girl who was dressed as a boy for her own safety. And it's one of those nostalgia tropes. It isn't really that exciting or that necessary, but it's just a nostalgia thing. And then also with the ex-wife, or should I say hex-wife, sorry, I won't do that ever again. I almost promise. The ex-wife, the witch wife being actually a dragon. I'm like, okay, weird flex, but sure. And then I realized, oh, I'm getting huge Enchanted vibes. I love Enchanted. It's my favorite Disney film, probably. I don't know, it's been a bit, but I love it so much. Having the evil queen turn into the dragon and climb up the building, it gave me those feels, and I was just like, this is delightful. I love it. And it was a very typical hero comes in and saves the day, but it was not the hero that we were set up to believe. So I don't know, I really enjoyed it. There was a lot of nostalgia, even though it was something new and it was its own work, and I really did enjoy the characters as well. So finally, number 1 on my least favorite list, which again, a reminder, it's not that the works are bad, they're just not my thing. Number 1 on my least favorite is, I have like the memory span of, I can't even say a goldfish because that's insulting to goldfish. I have no brain cells. I have like one singular cell and it's split by about 5 different things. So it's a whole thing. Number 1 on my least favorite, Camouflage by Patricia A. McKillop. Oh boy. So this story, I respect where it was coming from. I respect where the author was coming from and the fact that they were trying to make it fun and make it kind of silly, but also kind of interesting and kind of mysterious. But when you've got too many kindas, oh boy. Basically, with the story being from a whole, ooh, look, a wizard school. This most certainly isn't a certain very popular wizard series. This is something entirely different. That's okay. It's not my favorite, but it's okay. The first actual short story in the anthology, I think it's called Matriculation, I want to say, did kind of the same thing, but I like the way that it did the wizard school idea a little bit better. The problem is, this story goes a lot of places very fast. There's a lot going on. It's kind of just a bag of confetti. To some, maybe it's a little more understandable than it is for me, but it goes a lot of places very quickly, very fast, and only kind of explains them. There is a little bit of exposition throughout the text, but it just feels like you're here 1 second and then here another second and then here another second, and then we finally expose on, that that second plot point that we used to be on, but oh, back over here now. It just felt kind of, it's hard to explain. It bounces back and forth a lot with a lot of very surreal ideas. Like, it starts out very humble in the fact that you've got a kid in class and his magical implement that he's given to by his teacher is a piece of crap, quite literally. And then suddenly, well, there's dragons, and there's a dragon speaker, and there's armies, and apparently this is historical, but there's other things, and it's like, it just felt like there was a lot. There was just a lot going on. It was, in my brain, it was a hot mess. Maybe on paper it's not, but in my brain, with my one brain cell, it was a hot mess. The characterization to the story, it wasn't awful, but also I didn't care. I just didn't care about the characters. They were kind of like, yeah, they exist. They're like, yeah. Like, I should have been interested by the idea of, oh, young girl who can talk to dragons, which I kind of was, but also I wasn't. Like, I didn't care about her. I didn't care about any of the focal characters. I just didn't. And some of the vernacular and the terminology I just felt was a little bit lazy. I don't mean to be insulting, but it did seem kind of lazy. Like, you know, camo dragons. Okay, they're dragons that camouflage. Well, could you give them a better name than camo dragons? And to constantly call them camos just makes me feel like I'm in the boonies, and the boonies is not usually what I associate with dragons. And also constantly calling octopi octos, and also the idea that dragons and octopi were getting together is just, how does that work? Like, is that how this universe works? This concerns me slightly. This is just, that's a whole other egg to crack. It's not, it's just, it's a lot. When you get to the ending and there's the conversation between, here we go again, searching the book. Will. I don't know how I forgot that name. I love that name. When you get to the final part of the story and Will and his professor are talking, I'm pretty sure I only understood like 20% of the dialogue that was happening there. This wizard is insane. He makes zero sense, and I understand that the idea of like the nutty professor is a very popular thing, especially with wizards, because they're nuts. But I couldn't make sense of it. Like, I don't know. Will has a special ability with the dragons, and he's supposed to unlock that and learn about it, but there was a much better way that could have been explained instead of me being like, well, I guess this means that and that, and So in short, maybe it's great for other people. Maybe I'm just really dense, but I didn't get it. It wasn't fleshed out enough for me to love the world, and it just didn't make sense. I don't know, I guess I would have liked maybe a little more clear exposition for some of the weird bits, or just leave some of the weird bits out and just have a more simplified story. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. So, before we get to my number one most favorite story in the whole book, oh, I'm excited. I want to talk about some honorable mentions. It was just things that I thought that were worth noting. There were two particular stories that I enjoyed reading and I hated reading at the same time. They were great, but also terrible. The first of these two stories is Yulie by Daniel Abraham. So, I'm not a huge fan of very coarse writing. Like, I can get past, some profanity, some roughness, some rough characters as well. But from the point of view character in this story, woo, oh, he's a hot mess. Oh, he's got a lot going on. And I understand that. It's not something where it's like, oh, that's like a totally awful, horrible, bad thing. It's just, it's the nature of the character. He's an ex-spy, assassin, whatever the heck he is. So yeah, he's gonna be a really rough guy and he's got some issues. But it doesn't mean I like to read in that style. Usually I don't tend to read from those sorts of characters' points of view because it makes me a little uncomfortable. But I did enjoy the story in that its comparisons, its kind of metaphorical use of the main character Yuli's kind of draconic essences, in the fact that he is definitely a human, but he's a hoarder, he's nasty, he's got a lot of crap going on. And using that and then comparing it, or kind of using as a foil, a Dungeons and Dragons story, which, as you could probably tell if you go look at a couple of the videos I've made, I've got a little soft spot for some Dungeons and Dragons. I so appreciated seeing a D&D tabletop campaign going on in the background, and kind of the way it was represented and the way it was used as a, I don't know, a lot of things, a mirror, a foil, so many different things for the story of Yuli. And it was just like, this is difficult to read, but I like it. It was a whole thing. It was a whole thing. The second one I want to talk about is something we don't talk about. We don't talk about The Dragon by Sarah Gailey. So here's the thing. I did take a little bit of issue to the way the story was written, in that the narrator makes the assertion that the focal character knows what you're thinking. I don't like that because it was always wrong. But she did not know what I was thinking. But I did appreciate the way this story was written very, very much. The style was perfectly great. It also was not comfortable to read. It was not comfortable to read at all because of the subject matter. It has a very obvious, not even metaphor. It's too blunt to be a metaphor. It just smacks you straight up the face and says, hey, you want some childhood trauma? There you go. And it's like, thanks. It is primarily about abusive relationships, not physically abusive, but emotionally abusive relationships. And as somebody who kind of understands where that is coming from, it got me in the feels. It gave me a big oof. Big oof. And I did not like reading it because it was very relatable. But it was also very enjoyable, very well done, a very delightful way to frame a very real world issue and kind of to describe some household dynamics in some families. So it was not comfortable. I did not like reading it, but I really enjoyed reading it because it was really good. Now, two other stories I also wanted to mention very, very quickly. Again, as I mentioned, I was looking for high fantasy. I was hoping for high fantasy. I only got a little bit. But there are two really good stories that I did quite enjoy. The first story that I was totally engrossed in the anthology, it was Habitat by K.J. Parker, and the second was The Long Walk by Kate Elliott. Both of these were really enjoyable. They had their own little ecosystems and their own little worlds where the world building was done very efficiently, very well, so that you kind of had a scope of the world that these authors were working in, without it feeling too exposition heavy, without it really bogging you down. And the characters were presented in a way that you really did feel for them, that you really did care about their journeys in life. And the twists, it's funny. Both stories, and because this is the spoilery part, I can say this, both stories at the end reveal that people turn into dragons. I only just made that connection right now while talking. Wow. Anyways, though, that's not to say that they aren't both still unique. They're very unique and they're very enjoyable, and I really, really did enjoy both of them. They had that, high fantasy, great nostalgic lore that I was looking for. So that was really exciting. Okay, it's time for my favorite part. I am so excited. My favorite story out of the entire anthology of the Book of Dragons is very, very good. It's La Vitesse by Kelly Robson. Where do I begin? So I don't think I expected for a dragon story set in very modern times to be my favorite story out of the bunch. I really didn't. Honestly, I would have probably said that Dragon Slayer was my favorite without this one, just because it was so high fantasy and so like traditionalist dragons and adventure and stuff like that. So the interesting thing is, no, this is a modern story and I really enjoyed it. Part of it is just because it was written so well in that it's a short story and it fits perfectly inside itself. I don't know if that makes sense, but some of the stories felt like, well, they began too early or they ended too abruptly, or you just kind of like, you wanted more, but not in the way of just, oh yeah, I'd read a whole book about this, but like you needed to know more because it wasn't full enough and it didn't have enough to it. I feel like We Continue didn't have enough to it, and I feel like Dragon Slayer ended a little bit abruptly, but La Vitesse is very, very self-contained and is just perfectly written inside the sphere of a short story. So I thought that that was very well done. I love this story, for one, for its pacing. The suspense was great. I'm not usually a suspense person, but I do appreciate when a book can actually get me on the edge of my seat, and this one had me fully engrossed going, wait, what's gonna happen next? What's gonna happen next? High-speed bus chase, what's gonna happen? It was really great. And the pacing itself, beyond the suspense, was very good because the author used different chunks of kind of flashbacks and narration to explain, hey, these are the characters that we're working with. This is Bee's backstory, and this is, oh goodness, this is the last time I'm gonna look for names, I promise. Rosie. This is Bee's backstory. This is Rosie's backstory. This is kind of, explaining everything about the town and the people and everything that's been going on. So the flashbacks were really good because they cut through the tension. They gave us kind of like reposes, quiet moments to go, oh, okay, so all this crazy stuff is happening, but meanwhile, let's explain the world a little bit more. So it was very nicely balanced between tension and humor and, sad little interludes that explained all the character tension outside of dragon tension. It was just really, really good prose. Really well balanced, and I enjoy it. Secondly, I really loved the characters. They weren't overly poured into like, oh man, so crazy, but they felt organically explained and organically built up where, they felt like, hey, real people. Caricatures in a sense, yes, especially Rosie, because of course she's got the, ooh, she's the bad girl kind of vibe, but the story explains it really well and in a really sensitive and thoughtful way to kind of be like, well, yeah, no wonder things have turned out the way they have. In the end, between Bea and Rosie and all of the random kids whose names I definitely wouldn't remember, you were rooting for them and you wanted them to be okay. So in a very short period of time, I was, engrossed and I was endeared to these characters because I cared about what was going to happen to them. I cared about their well-being. I also just enjoyed the fact that, hey, the dragon was a dragon. Now I understand that I did just say that I prefer dragons as characters rather than dragons as beasts, but this is where dragons as beasts was used so well, because instead of just being, oh yeah, they're dragons, that's normal, they're just animals. This was a scary dragon. This was a very scary dragon, and the fact that it was a battle. This predator was just, it was really cool. It was really fun. I enjoyed it. It was the sort of thing where it was a very nice marriage of classic dragons and modern setting in a way that felt coherent and cohesive and not forced. So I just give so many props to the author for that. I just thought it was absolutely delightful, and I would absolutely read more. I would absolutely read more, but the story didn't leave me with that need for like, oh no, it's not complete, it needs more. It was complete. It did what it was supposed to do, and it'll definitely bring me back to the author in the future. So, that is my review, that is my summary, that is my discussion on the Book of Dragons. If you wanna make any comments about what I had to say, or what I didn't say, or ask some questions, or just say hi, you can obviously go down into the comments. You're competent people. I know you know how to do that if you wanna. But thank you for watching. I appreciate it if you made it this far, and I appreciate that you appreciate dragons. Probably the way I do. And hey, just remember, love God, love each other, and love books and love dragons, and well, there you go. What else do you need in the world?